And New Prospect, welcome to RTB 2021 for November the 7th, 2021. Hope you're having a great day on this Sunday. And I hope you have a wonderful time of being with your families and just enjoying the Lord on this day, on this Lord's Day. So our text for today, we have 2 Kings 20, we have Hebrews 2, then we have Hosea 13, and finally Psalm 137 and 138. Well, we're starting the Psalms. So Psalm 137, 138, we have two really different types of Psalms. Psalm 137, if you remember this summer, was one of the hardest ones I preached on this summer. This is the Psalm that's probably the most famous imprecatory Psalm in the Bible. Remember what an imprecatory Psalm is. It's a Psalm that calls down judgment upon one's enemies or the enemies of God. In this case, the judgment being called down is due to one thing. We see that the psalmist begins by the rivers of Babylon. We sat down and wept, and we remembered Zion, and these types of things. Well, the obvious context here is someone in exile. So someone who has been through that horrific event, the Babylonians coming in 586 BC and wiping out Jerusalem, wiping out the temple, tearing families apart, and removing you ultimately from the land that was promised to you. How would you react? And then they get you over into the promised land, and they're making you sing these songs kind of to mock you. And all along you have distant relatives like the Edomites who are celebrating and praising the Babylonians for what they were doing and encouraging him on, saying, raise it to its very foundation. Well, the psalmist responds with a deep hurt, and he responds by asking for God to repay. And we have that famous verse in verse 9, asking God, or saying, how blessed is the one who seizes and dashes the little ones against the rocks. Well, it's pretty stark, isn't it? Pretty shocking bit of language, but I think it's meant to be so. For the psalmist to sit down and write this is not uncontrolled anger. This is an expression of a righteous anger and a desire for God to do what God can do, to bring judgment on those who deserve it. So how do we handle things like this? Well, you can go back and listen to my full sermon on Psalm 137 back a few months ago, but Psalm 137, I think, is one that ultimately shows us that God is a God who does hold people to account and will hold people to account. And we can have faith and cry out to God in times of injustice, knowing that God will one day bring forth that kind of justice. Psalm 138, on the other hand, is more of a psalm of thanksgiving. Speaks of the thanksgiving that he desires to give with all his heart, but he also confesses that the kings of the earth will give thanks to you when they have heard the words of your mouth. So this is also one that has more of a global perspective, that God will be recognized for who he is by the entirety of the world. So Psalm 137, 138. Let's move over to, why don't we go over to Hebrews? So remember that Hebrews, this epistolary sermon that is written anonymously and has this high Christology, celebrating Jesus for what he is as the Son of God, as God incarnate, and yet he became flesh for a specific purpose. And this text talks to us about this. Now, we also, in the very first part of this chapter, we find the first of what will be several warning texts in the book of Hebrews. This is a book that's famous for its warning texts, where it warns, basically, as verse 3 says, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Let's not drift away. Let's keep on persevering. Let's keep on running the race that is set before us, as Hebrews will talk about later on in this text. Well, these warnings are there for that purpose, to help us to persevere and help us to exhort us to continue on. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. This is not the most famous of the warning texts, and they do present some theological questions. And we'll tackle that, I think, when we get to chapter 6 of Hebrews. And then we have a section here where, once again, he's describing the superiority of Jesus over the angels. But then I want to focus in on the last part, because this is a beautiful text starting in verse 14. He says, we'll just read it. He says, since the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same. Speaking of Jesus. So speaking of his incarnation, that he took part of flesh and blood, and it's a reason. There's a reason for that, that through death, he might render powerless him who had the power over death, and that is the devil. And he might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. It was necessary, in other words, for Jesus to become flesh so that he might die to death that we deserve. It is part and parcel of his work on our behalf. Therefore, he had to be made like his brethren in all things. And because he did, he experienced all the temptations and things like that we experienced, and yet he did so without sin, and thus he can be also our great high priest. So a wonderful text here, speaking of the person and work and nature of Jesus, and the necessity of that nature for us in our Christian walks. That's Hebrews 2. Let's move over we'll go over to Hosea 13. So in Hosea 13, we have, once again, idolatry being condemned by Hosea. It kind of walks through some of the history of Israel, talking about how they had really followed Baal from the very beginning as a nation. If you remember back to the division of the kingdom, this is what they did. And yet it wasn't intended to be so. When God brought them out of the land of Egypt and brought them into a covenant relationship with him, they were not to know any God except him. And there was no savior for them except him. He has always been that exclusive God, the one who had the exclusive right to their allegiance. And yet they instead ran away. And therefore God has given given them over to that sin. And their sin, verse 12, has been stored up. And then you have this interesting quote here. This is, of course, a text that's probably familiar to you. Paul quotes this in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol, the place of the dead, representative of death? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion will be hidden from my sight. Now, this is obviously a judgment text. Paul actually uses this in 1 Corinthians 15 as a kind of a question of it's in the context of talking about the resurrection and how the resurrection has defeated death. And he says there, "O death, where's your victory? O death, where's your sting?" Well, is Paul misusing it here? Because he's using it in a text that obviously celebrates God's great salvation through the resurrection. Well, I think the point in both of those texts actually is that God is the one who has control over death. In this case, in the early Israelites, for this nation of Israel, as the Assyrians are about to come in and destroy them as a judgment of God, God has control over death and can use that for his judgment. But at the same time, Paul says that in the resurrection, he also proved once again that he has control over death, that death has no victory ultimately because Jesus defeated it. And really, God's had control over it from the very beginning, isn't it? He is the God of who grants life and can take it away. And ultimately, he is the one who can defeat death once and for all, which is what he did in the resurrection. So that's Hebrews 13. One more chapter Hosea 13. One more chapter in Hosea, and we'll be done with the book of Hosea. And that brings us finally to 2 Kings 20. Now, we just yesterday got to the great high point in the history of the Jewish people after Solomon, especially in the divided kingdom. This is definitely the high point where God gives them this miraculous deliverance. But then we get to this story in 2 Kings 20. Now, what's interesting about this story is probably what happens in this account, at least in the first part of it, actually comes before what happened in 2 Kings 18 and 19, specifically the siege of the Assyrians. Hezekiah in this text becomes mortally ill. Now, I think we've talked about this before, but my dissertation was on this. My first book was on this, the death stories in the Old Testament. Well, here is the death story of Hezekiah. It's actually, by the way, the last death story in the Old Testament. And it's what I would call an incomplete death story. It's a death story that is not going the way it should go. So if you remember some of our discussions of previous major figures in the Old Testament who died, we had people like Joshua and Joseph and Moses and Jacob and Abraham, all these, even David, all these characters. What they did without fail is that there would be an announcement of impending death, and usually it's in the narrator's mouth, or someone like, or even the character himself will say, "I'm about to go the way of all the earth," or "I'm about to go sleep with the fathers," or whatever. And then the majority of the text would be where that individual character would put their house in order, prepare the way for the whatever the next generation to follow. And then there would be this kind of anticlimactic statement of the death of the individual. Well, here we have Hezekiah being informed. And by the way, that happens in every single one of them. So for instance, just to give you an example, Abraham sets his house in order by doing what? By finding a wife for Isaac. Or Moses sets his house in order by choosing a successor in Joshua, and so on and so forth. David sets his house in order, albeit with some difficulty. He sets his house in order by naming Solomon as his successor and then charging him and giving him some final words in 1 Kings 2. Well, look at this text. In those days, the narrator tells us that Hezekiah became mortally ill. In other words, he's got a sickness that's going to lead to his death. And then here comes Isaiah that comes along and says, "Set your house in order." There it is. Command your house, for you will die and not live. This is the only place in the Old Testament among all those death stories where we have a twofold, right in a row, statement of impending death. In other words, Hezekiah, you're going to die. There's no doubt about it. So what should Hezekiah do? Well, Isaiah tells us what he should do. Put your house in order. Well, what does Hezekiah do instead? Well, he probably does what we would do. He begs for more time, and God gives him more time, 15 more years, in fact. But you can't help but wonder, based on our knowledge of those other stories, that something is not going right here. In fact, what Hezekiah should have done, perhaps, is do what Isaiah had told him to do, and set his house in order. But what happens instead is that God ends up granting those 15 years, and he should have used those 15 years to set his house in order. But instead, what he does is he puts his house in a state of disorder. Several things happen in those 15 years. Number one of the things that happens is that Hezekiah has a visit from some envoys from Babylon. And these envoys come ostensibly to congratulate him on his healing. But really, they're kind of scouting things out. And Isaiah comes to Hezekiah and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" Showing him all the jewels of your palace and of the temple. "Oh, what are you doing? These same people who you showed all these things to are going to come in here and get it and take it away and steal it." And that's exactly what happens, of course, 100 years after Hezekiah, when the Babylonians come in. So that's one thing he does to set his house in the state of disorder. The other thing is unstated in the text, and that is that he has a son during this time, and his son's name is Manasseh. And as we'll find out in chapter 21, Manasseh becomes the worst king that the Jews ever had. And obviously, he did not train up this child in the way he should go. This child goes far awry from where Hezekiah himself was. So Hezekiah's incomplete death story here, or his death story that goes awry here, ends up being a death story where it shows that Israel is the state of the king, and the house of Israel and the house of David is in a state of disorder. So why then? Here's my question to you: why put this at the end of Hezekiah's story and not where it should have gone at the beginning? So remember that the story about Sennacherib coming in actually happened after this event. where Hezekiah begs for more time. So why not put that at the first? Well, what the author is doing here is he's preparing the way for the rest of the books of Kings. From this point onward, we're on a downward spiral towards exile. And this sets us up for that by putting this disordered house right next to Manasseh, frankly. It sets us up for the rest of the story, where the rest of the history of Israel, the rest of the history of Judah, which will be a history of downward spiral towards exile from that point onward. So it's kind of a rearranging that's done on the part of the author in order to set up thematically what's going to happen in the rest of the books of Kings. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I explained that well or not, but it's an interesting story. We'll see how this is different when we get to the book of Chronicles, but we'll wait on that until then. So I think that's all for today. We've got our 2 Kings passage. We did Hebrews 2, we did Hosea 13, and we did our Psalms text as well. So we have a great rest of the day on this day, November 7th, 2021.